In a dark, forgotten vault deep within space, a creature once feared by empires lies imprisoned, chained, and forgotten. But when a simple mechanic, with nothing but water and stories, dares to offer kindness, he sparks a chain of events that will awaken the most terrifying beast in the galaxy. Will the Thirstbringer rise again, or will it remain a prisoner forever? If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. Let's jump into this incredible story. In the farthest reaches of the galaxy, there was once a creature known only as Thaler, a being of unimaginable power. It was not a dragon like those told in the ancient tales, nor was it a god, though many had once believed it to be. Thaler had earned the terrifying title of the Thirstbringer for the devastation it caused. The creature's breath alone could drain entire oceans, turning flourishing worlds into barren wastelands. On 5 different worlds, Thaler unleashed its might, leaving not a drop of water in the oceans and turning vibrant landscapes into dust. Its fire could scorch the very moons, turning them into nothing more than glowing cinders. The Empire, once its master, marveled at Thaler's power. It was a tool to keep the Empire's dominance across the galaxy unchallenged, a weapon of mass destruction when called upon by the emperors. Yet power has a way of twisting even the most unshakable alliances. The emperors, driven by fear and the shadow of Thaler's immense power, began to worry that they had created a monster too dangerous to control. As the galaxy's balance of power shifted, the same emperors who had commanded Thaler now saw it as a threat, something too dangerous to keep alive. Politics played a dangerous game, and whispers of betrayal moved through the royal courts. With an iron fist, the emperors made their decision. They sentenced Thaler to a fate far worse than death. They decided the creature must be bound, not just physically, but mentally. They would chain Thaler in a prison so cold and desolate that even the thought of escape would be impossible. The prison they chose was the Hollow Vault, a fractured asteroid located at the edge of the galaxy. The Hollow Vault was a place that even the stars seemed reluctant to shine upon, a black hole of isolation. It was said that even gravity rebelled here, as if the very laws of nature tried to abandon the place. The asteroid had once been a mining station, its hollowed-out chambers filled with abandoned machinery and forgotten tunnels. Now it would become the tomb of Thaler, where the creature would remain chained, its massive form unable to move or escape. Thick graviton chains were used to bind its limbs, preventing even the slightest movement. Molecular inhibitors were implanted deep in its throat, stopping it from swallowing anything. No food, no water, no relief. The punishment was as cruel as it was thorough. Thaler, once the terror of empires, was now reduced to nothing more than a prisoner of stillness. For 127 long years, Thaler lay there in darkness, a conscious being trapped in its own broken body. No sedatives, no sleep cycles, and no escape. The creature had no ability to speak, to scream, or to cry out in pain. There were no guards who could hear the agony that echoed in Thaler's mind, no allies to offer comfort. The creature's body, once a furnace of burning power, now burned with an unquenchable thirst. But worse than that was the knowledge that Thaler had been abandoned, forgotten by all who once feared and revered it. The walls of its prison bore the scars of its suffering, thick, molten lines etched into the stone where Thaler's breath had burned into the rock, a silent testament to the pain it endured. Despite the brutal isolation, Thaler remained aware, trapped in a body that could not move, could not rest, and could not even dream. The centuries dragged on in endless torment. Then, by accident, everything changed. A new worker arrived at the Hollow Vault, unaware of the legendary beast hidden within. Merrick Holloway was nothing more than a lowly engineer, a mechanic from one of the far-flung Terran outposts, assigned to check the structural integrity of the vault. Merrick wasn't a soldier or a scientist. He had no great importance in the grand scale of things. He was just another cog in the machine, tasked with repairing old rusted beams and fixing broken doors. He expected nothing more than to find a few neglected panels and maybe some faulty wiring. But as he moved through the dark corridors of the hollow vault, Merrick unknowingly stepped into the mythic heart of the place. He had accidentally stumbled upon Zone Theta 7, a section of the vault sealed off from the rest of the facility. At first, all Merrick saw was darkness, but something felt wrong and unease in the air that he couldn't explain. His eyes adjusted, and as he moved forward, he caught sight of something that froze him in his tracks. There, chained and bound in the center of the chamber, lay a creature that defied all reason. Its ribs jutted out like cracked stone towers, and its eyes, deep, sunken, and filled with millennia of suffering, stared back at him. The creature's mouth was open, its tongue hanging limply from its jaw, blackened and swollen as though it had been burned from within. It was no longer the mighty force of destruction that had once terrorized worlds. It was a broken shell of its former self, lying helpless and forgotten. For a moment, Merrick was rooted to the spot. Every instinct in him screamed to turn and run, to escape the presence of something so terrifying. But something in the creature's eyes kept him still. It wasn't anger he saw in those eyes, nor was it hatred. Instead, there was a question, a silent plea for something Merrick couldn't understand. The creature, Thaler, seemed to be asking, "Are you real?" It was as if the beast was desperate for acknowledgement, desperate to know that it hadn't been abandoned by the universe entirely. And in that moment, Merrick did something that no one would have expected. He didn't turn his back or call for reinforcements. Instead, he reached for the half-empty tin flask that hung from his belt, a flask that carried nothing more than a lukewarm metallic drink. With no thought of fear or danger, Merrick walked forward, his feet heavy with uncertainty, and slowly began to offer the creature what little he had. The first drop of water fell from the flask, sliding down Thaler's cracked tongue into the depths of its throat. And when it did, something incredible happened. The silence of the chamber was broken not by a roar, but by a sound far older, a primal cry of pain, longing, and for the first time in years, a flicker of life. Merrick stood frozen, staring down at the creature that had once been the terror of the galaxy. He had never expected this. He had never imagined he would come face to face with something like Thaler, a creature whose name alone was enough to make even the bravest soldiers tremble. Yet here he was, standing in the heart of a forgotten vault, watching as the beast he had only heard of in whispered stories reacted to the first drop of water he had offered. The sound that came from Thaler was not a roar of fury or a growl of defiance. Instead, it was something deeper, something ancient. It was the sound of a creature awakening from a nightmare that had lasted for centuries. Merrick had no words for what he was witnessing. All he could do was stand there, unsure of what to do next, his mind racing with questions that seemed impossible to answer. For a moment, the chamber was still. Thaler's glowing eyes, once dark and lifeless, now seemed to flicker with something that could almost be called life. The dragon's wings, once curled and useless against its back, twitched slightly. Its breath, deep and rattling, began to steady. Merrick felt a strange sense of calm washing over him, as if, for the first time since he had stepped into this forsaken place, the air itself had changed. It was as if the very vault, once oppressive with the weight of Thaler's suffering, had taken on a new energy. The creature wasn't just drinking water. It was beginning to come back to life in a way that Merrick couldn't fully understand. Merrick didn't move, not at first. He simply watched as the dragon's tongue moved, slowly licking the last of the liquid from the flask. His heart beat loudly in his chest as the realization hit him. He wasn't just hydrating a beast. He was offering it something much more profound. He was offering it a chance to feel something again, to experience the relief of comfort, of kindness, after so long in torment. His mind raced with the weight of what he had just done. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a foreman sent to fix things, to check the integrity of a facility. But in this moment, he knew that something far bigger was happening. Something he couldn't put into words. As Merrick hesitated, Thaler moved again. The dragon's head, heavy and slow, lifted just slightly. It was not an aggressive movement. There was no malice in the gesture, just a quiet acknowledgement. It was as if the creature was unsure, but somehow it recognized Merrick's presence, recognized that this man, who had no power, no status, was the first to show it any kind of care. It was then that Merrick felt something stir deep within him, something unexpected. He wasn't afraid. No, not anymore. He wasn't worried about being consumed by the dragon's wrath. Instead, there was an overwhelming sense of responsibility that settled on his shoulders. He knew, in that moment, that he couldn't leave this creature to suffer alone. He had seen its pain, its hunger, and now he had a choice: to walk away or to keep coming back. The weeks that followed were strange. Merrick returned to the hollow. Vault every day, each time with a new flask of water, sometimes a ration from the supply line, sometimes just his presence. The guards who oversaw the facility, far from noticing his activities, hardly questioned him. They saw him as a mechanic, no different from any of the other workers who came and went, taking care of the mundane tasks required to keep the vault running. No one suspected that Merrick, in his unremarkable way, was forming a bond with a creature thought to be long dead, a creature that, for reasons Merrick couldn't fully explain, had begun to look forward to his visits. Merrick never came with weapons or tools for battle. He never came with grand plans. He simply came with what he had: water, food, and sometimes stories. In the quiet, isolated space of Fowler's cell, Merrick began to speak to the creature. He told it stories of humanity, of myths and legends, of heroes and beasts. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the ramblings of a tired mechanic passing the time. But with each passing day, something shifted. Merrick could feel it in the air. Thaler was listening. The creature's massive head would tilt slightly. When Merrick spoke, its eyes would blink slowly, and though it never made a sound, Merrick knew it was absorbing the words, the emotions, the stories of the world outside the vault. One day, as Merrick spoke of an ancient tale about a warrior who had been betrayed by his own people, he noticed something different. Thaler's massive claw shifted, scraping softly against the stone floor. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible. But to Merrick, it was a sign, an acknowledgement, perhaps, or an unspoken request. Thaler had moved, not in anger, but as if to say, "I understand." The realization hit Merrick hard. This was more than just a prisoner and a guard. This was a connection that transcended species, that went beyond fear and power. Thaler had suffered. Yes, but it had also learned how to endure, how to survive, just as Merrick had in his own life. Merrick's visits continued, each day a little longer, each moment a little more profound. He began to bring more than just water. He brought music, stories, and sometimes just a quiet presence. It was on one of these days, as Merrick sat beside the dragon in the dim light of the hollow vault, that something happened. Thaler, still bound and broken, lowered its head just slightly as Merrick spoke. It was a gesture so small, so simple, yet it spoke volumes. For the first time since its imprisonment, Thaler had allowed itself to be seen, to be heard. And Merrick, the simple foreman with no grand ambitions, had been the one to offer that kindness. There was no grand miracle. There was no moment of sudden change. But in the silence of the vault, a bond had formed, unspoken and strong. Thaler, the once feared beast, had begun to trust again, not because of power or force, but because someone had seen it for what it truly was, a being worthy of compassion. And Merrick, without realizing it, had become more than just a mechanic. He had become a witness to the quiet, powerful rebirth of something that had long been forgotten. As the days turned into weeks, Merrick's routine had become something of a quiet ritual. Each morning, he would arrive at the hollow vault, carrying with him flasks of water, sometimes food, and always a story or two. The silence of the vault was no longer oppressive. It had become a space filled with the soft sound of Merrick's voice and the slow, steady breathing of the creature within. He had come to understand something he never could have imagined before. Thaler, the mighty Thirstbringer, was not just a prisoner of the Empire. It was a soul in pain, a soul that needed to be seen, to be acknowledged. And Merrick had done that. He had walked into the vault without fear, offering nothing but simple kindness, and in return, had begun to awaken something in the creature he could never have expected. Each time Merrick arrived, Thaler would lift its head ever so slightly, as if acknowledging his presence. The first time it happened, Merrick had been startled. He had been telling a story about a great warrior who had fought for peace, and when he paused for a moment, Thaler's massive head had moved just enough for him to see the creature's eyes alive, watching him. It was subtle, but to Merrick, it was enough. That one small movement told him more than any words ever could. Thaler was listening. It was understanding. And as the days passed, it seemed as though the dragon was becoming more present in the world around it. Its claws, once stiff and still, began to twitch. Its wings, which had been nothing more than dried husks, now shifted slightly in response to Merrick's voice. But it wasn't just the physical changes that Merrick noticed. It was the emotional weight that seemed to lift from the vault, inch by inch, as if the very walls were beginning to breathe again. Merrick had no scientific training, no knowledge of how to heal a creature of Thaler's magnitude, but what he did have was patience, and an understanding that sometimes all a soul needed was someone to listen to its story. And that was exactly what Merrick did. Every day, without fail, he came and spoke to the creature. He didn't demand anything in return. He didn't expect a roar of victory or a sign that Thaler was suddenly whole. He simply spoke, and with each word, with each day, something was changing. Something was waking up. And one day, something extraordinary happened. Merrick had brought with him a new story, one he had told many times before, but today, the words felt different. The tale was of a once feared beast who had become a protector, a creature who had been misunderstood by those who should have known better. As he spoke the words, a soft sound echoed from the back of the vault. It was faint at first, like a low, rumbling growl, but it was not a sound of anger. It was something else, something deep, something primal. Merrick's voice faltered for a moment as he realized what was happening. Thaler, the creature that had been silent for so long, was making a sound that seemed to resonate through the very stones of the vault. Merrick stopped speaking, unsure of what to do, but he didn't move away. He stayed, waiting, heart pounding in his chest. The rumble grew louder, deeper, and for a split second, Merrick wondered if he should be afraid. But then something in his gut told him it wasn't fear he was feeling. It was awe. The sound was not one of pain or hunger. It wasn't a threat. It was a sound of life, of a creature who had been buried under centuries of suffering and isolation, now finding its voice again. Merrick took a cautious step forward, unsure of how to respond to this sudden shift. He knew he had to be gentle, to honor the trust Thaler had placed in him. So he spoke again, softly, as if the vault itself were listening. He didn't ask for anything, didn't demand anything. He simply acknowledged what was happening, and with that, the sound from Thaler ceased. In the days that followed, the changes became even more noticeable. Thaler, though still bound by the graviton chains, no longer seemed as passive as it had before. Its head moved more frequently, its massive tail stirred the dust on the floor, and its once lifeless wings fluttered with increasing strength. The creature was not rising, not yet, but it was no longer dormant. It was awake, aware of itself in ways that Merrick had only dared to hope for. There was a glimmer in Thaler's eyes, a flicker of intelligence, of understanding. It was as if the dragon was waking up from a long, painful dream, and Merrick was there to witness it. Merrick's presence had become a ritual not just for him, but for Thaler. He had learned to read the dragon's small, silent gestures, the way it shifted its claws or blinked its eyes. Each day, he brought something new to the vault. Sometimes it was a song from his homeland, a melody he remembered from his childhood. Sometimes it was a story about the stars, or about the strange, wonderful things that humans had built. And every time Thaler listened, its head tilting slightly, its eyes locked on Merrick. The bond between them, fragile at first, had slowly solidified into something deep and unspoken. The strange thing was, Merrick didn't feel the weight of his actions. He didn't feel like a savior or a hero. He simply felt like a man who had been in the right place at the right time, and had done the one thing that no one else had bothered to do. He had treated the dragon like a being, not a weapon. And in return, Thaler had responded in the only way it knew how, by showing Merrick that it was still alive, still capable of feeling, of understanding, of remembering. And though they hadn't exchanged any words, Merrick knew. He knew that he had touched something ancient, something powerful, and that, in some way, Thaler had touched him right back. It wasn't a miraculous healing. It wasn't a grand, dramatic awakening. But it was something just as important, the beginning of a quiet, profound change. For the first time in centuries, Thaler was no longer alone, and for the first time in his life, Merrick understood the power of simply being present. Merrick had never felt more at peace or more unsure in his life. It had been months since that first drop of water had fallen from his flask into the cracked mouth of Thaler, and in that time, the bond between them had grown deeper, more complex. Each day, Merrick continued to visit the hollow vault, bringing with him stories, songs, and the simple companionship that seemed to make Thaler feel more alive. He never asked for anything in return, never expected the dragon to change in any grand, dramatic way. But something was shifting. Something was awakening. Thaler, once the mighty terror of the Empire, was no longer a monster in a cage. It was a being, a soul, who had endured unimaginable suffering and had finally begun to heal. Then, one morning, the vault felt different. The air was heavier, charged with a sense of anticipation Merrick couldn't quite place. As he approached the familiar dark corridors, he sensed something beyond the usual silence. Thaler had been restless the day before, moving more than usual, stretching its wings and twitching its claws in ways Merrick hadn't seen before. Today, the dragon's presence was more intense. Its enormous body shifted in the shadows, its glowing eyes tracking Merrick's every step. He stepped cautiously into the chamber, his heart beating a little faster than usual, but he didn't hesitate. He had no need for fear. Not anymore. Merrick spoke softly, as he always did, but today, Thaler did not respond in the usual way. There were no small movements, no slight tilts of the head. The creature simply stared at him, its eyes wide and intense, as if contemplating something far larger than Merrick's presence. The silence stretched between them, and Merrick felt a shift in the atmosphere, as though the very stones of the vault were holding their breath. Then, without warning, Thaler's massive wings stirred, sending a wave of dust through the chamber. The sound was like thunder, deep and primal. Merrick stepped back in surprise, but Thaler made no move to attack. Instead, the dragon's wings unfurled, stretching out for the first time in centuries. The sight was both breathtaking and terrifying. The wings, once limp and useless, were now full of life, shimmering with scales that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. They were powerful, ancient, and impossibly beautiful. Merrick knew something was about to happen. He couldn't explain it, but everything about the way Thaler moved told him that the dragon was preparing for something momentous. The tension in the air was thick, and for the first time since he had met Thaler, Merrick felt the weight of the creature's past and present collide. He understood that the time for just water and stories had passed. Thaler had been patient, had allowed itself to heal, but now it was ready for something more. Something beyond this cave, beyond the hollow. Vault. Merrick approached the creature cautiously, feeling a sense of awe wash over him. Thaler's eyes locked onto his, and for a long moment, it seemed as if the dragon was searching his soul. The bond they had formed, so quiet and unspoken, now felt like a thread connecting them across time and space. Thaler lowered its head. Slightly, just enough to show Merrick that it was listening, that it recognized him as something more than just the mechanic who had given it water. Merrick, his hands shaking slightly, spoke again, his voice soft but firm. He had no idea what the dragon was about to do, but he knew that whatever happened, it was something only he could witness. Without warning, Thaler's wings flared, and the creature took its first real steps in over 2,000 years. The ground trembled beneath its weight, the walls of the vault groaning as though they, too, recognized the significance of this moment. Merrick's heart raced as he watched the dragon move toward the entrance of the vault, the huge, powerful legs carrying the creature with surprising grace. For a moment, it seemed as if Thaler was testing its own strength, finding its footing after centuries of captivity. Then the dragon paused. It turned its head toward Merrick, and with a single piercing glance, it gestured toward the outside world. The message was clear. It was time. Merrick's mind spun with questions. He had never imagined that Thaler would ever leave the vault. He had thought the dragon was too broken, too scarred, to ever be free. But here it was, alive, awake, and determined to step into the light of day. Merrick followed without hesitation, his mind racing, but his feet moving in sync with the dragon's massive stride dot as they reached the opening of the vault. The outside world greeted them with the light of a new dawn. The sun rose slowly over the barren landscape, casting long shadows over the cracked earth. Merrick shielded his eyes, not from the brightness, but from the overwhelming sense of freedom that filled the air. Thaler stood at the edge of the vault, its wings fully extended, now shimmering with a faint, ethereal glow. The dragon looked up at the sky, as if remembering something ancient, something lost to time. And then, without warning, Thaler lifted into the air. The sight of the dragon soaring into the sky was something that Merrick would never forget. It wasn't a roar of triumph or a fearsome display of power. It was the quiet, graceful flight of a creature that had once been broken but was now free. Thaler moved slowly at first, as if unsure of its own strength, but then with a burst of energy, the dragon stretched its wings fully and soared higher, higher than Merrick could ever have imagined. Merrick stood below, watching as the dragon disappeared into the sky. The moment was perfect, and yet he knew it wasn't just the dragon that had been reborn. It was him too. He had not healed Thaler in any traditional sense. He had not fixed it or tamed it, but by offering the creature kindness, respect, and the chance to be seen, Merrick had helped bring something back to life. And that was something more powerful than anything the Empire or the galaxy could ever offer. The vault behind him seemed quieter now, emptier in a way. But in its emptiness, there was peace. Thaler, once a symbol of fear and destruction, had been freed by the simplest of acts, the act of being seen, of being heard. Merrick watched as the dragon flew, and he knew that the world would never be the same again. For Thaler, for him, and for the galaxy, it was a new beginning, a beginning fueled not by power, but by the quiet strength of kindness and understanding.